Hey friends, it's Laura. Are there some tricky products in your stash that you're having a hard time finding a use for? Let's dive into some product play and see how we can get them used.
So for today, we're going to talk about plastic three-dimensional embellishments. So there's a pretty big variety of these, and I don't use them a lot, but I do have some favorites, and so I want to share those with you. As far as acrylics, we'll start right in the center. Acrylics, I favor titles if I'm going to buy acrylics. I don't buy them super often. I tend to get them in grab bags or in kits more than just buying them outright, but I have bought some. Really like titles. Just think they're kind of a fun way to add a bit of plastic, non-papery goodness to the background. But I also really like these little scattering pieces, so like, you know, stars, hearts, asterisks, leaves. But they are in fact a type of plastic, so they're quite hard, they're quite dimensional, and they do stand out on your page. I've got a couple of L Studio titles here, and I have some scattering pieces. So I've got hearts, stars, and these stars here from Studio Calico. So those are fun. I like them a lot. They are very dimensional. I don't know if you can see, quite dimensional on your page, so keep that in mind. I also have buttons. This one you might be a little bit more familiar with. Some of these are wood, but most of these are plastic and come in a variety of sizes. Some of them were made specifically for scrapbooking and craft projects, and some of them were made more for clothing. Usually you can tell the difference by whether or not it has a flat back. This one has a flat back. This one does not, has more of a beveled back. I also have a piece of flare in here. I don't really buy flare, especially metal flare, and I don't use it super often. I do like the way that it looks, but it's just super dimensional. And so it's just not something I reach for super often, so I don't invest a lot of money in buying them. But if I get them in kits or collections, I do use them. Now for these two, some of my favorite things, to be honest. These are epoxy flare. I use these obviously much more often than the regular metal flare. And the reason is you get the impression of flare. So let me grab that back. It gives you the impression of flare, a rounded edge, an epoxy sort of top. It's very similar on a layout in how they look. The difference though is that epoxies are significantly thinner. And for me, that makes them a better choice overall. I can actually tuck them under photos. I can add them under layers and not just on top. Something to keep in mind. I'm also a huge fan of Scrap and Happy Studios flare, epoxy flare. They do regular flare too, but I really love their epoxy flare because she does such beautiful detailed pieces. And I am on her design team when I'm recording this at the moment. So she even did some Harry Potter ones. Oh my gosh, those might be my favorites. Then we have these little rosettes, and these are, they also go by capuchons. Capuchons? I think I'm saying that wrong. Capuchons. And they're just little plastic flowers. And most of them have a flat back so that you can glue them down onto your page. And while I love these so much, a lot of them are super dimensional. Not all of them, like I do have some like these that are super thin. Honestly, I have wood veneer that stands taller than that. And so I do pull those out occasionally, the really thin ones. But then I also have some that are quite thick. Let me see if I can find one. There are a few, here we go. There are a few, even though it's small, it is really thick and stands out quite a bit on a page. So I use those more for DIY projects. I decorated an entire wall letter with these and really love it. It sits on my wall now. But yeah, some of them are thin and usable. Some of them are not. Let me hold some up so you can see a little bit better. I love them because of how detailed they are. But I don't always love how tall they are. So there's the little rosettes. So now let me show you some layouts that illustrate how to use these lovely bits and pieces. Up first, we have some acrylic butterflies right off the bat. And these guys stand up pretty tall on the layout. And because I've given them a little butterfly trail behind them, they don't feel quite so clunky on the layout. Also because they're not the only butterflies. They don't stand out quite as much as they might otherwise, but because they're incorporated to an already existing theme, it works. Also, I have a couple of these little tassels down here at the bottom. Whenever I get these, I always use them right away because they're not something that I'm likely to reach for when I'm making a kit. And so I do try to use them pretty quickly on a page and get them used. Tassels are not my favorite either, but I do think they're kind of cool. And I love to mix up my albums and have these different non-paper components in my albums just for a bit of interest because it does catch your attention. You're like, oh, that's not paper, that's pretty, what is that? And it makes you kind of really take in the details of my clusters, and I love that. I love that about 3D non-paper embellishments. Okay, here is one using flare. So in this case, I've got a piece of flare here and here. Now you notice they're on top. It's because they're so dimensional, they have to go on top. You can't tuck them under things easily. And so keep that in mind. These are really a top layer embellishment. Now overall, I love the look of flare. And in this case, I've even popped several other paper embellishments up onto foam so that they don't stand out in a big way on the layout. They really kind of mix in nicely with these raised up shapes. And that's a great way to use your flare in a way that it doesn't take all of the attention away. I've also made a point of putting one of my flare close to my photos because if it's going to draw attention in, which this nice dark one definitely is on an otherwise fairly light and bright layout, I want it to draw attention to my photos and not away from my photos. Here's one using those beautiful rosettes. Now this is probably the main way that I use these flowers is to tuck them into floral clusters, sometimes as the actual center of the flower, and sometimes just as a little additional flower added onto a cluster. They are dimensional. They do stand out a little bit. They will add some chunk to your albums. That's your warning. Secondly, though, I don't really care because I love the way that they look. I don't use them on every page, and I just try to balance things out. I have a minimum number of pages that I want to get into each album, and as long as I meet around that range, I'm happy. Some of them can be chunky, some of them are flat, and I'm okay with that. So I really like adding just a few pages that are real chonkers. They are absolutely beautiful. I love this page so much. I have to tell you, just have to tell you. Next up, we have this lovely. So this is a boy layout. And you'll notice that a lot of the layouts I'm going to be showing you are pictures of my kids. And I think it's because I feel comfortable being more experimental on their pages. And I'm not sure why that is exactly, but it is true. I have found that I'm a bit more experimental on their pages rather than the family ones. And this one goes in my son's album. We were playing at a park on our trip to Michigan, and I've used these buttons and enamel dots, but buttons in the wreath. How cool is that? And because I've popped some things on foam, this photo and this camera are up on foam, these pieces here are up on foam, it doesn't stand out quite so much, and it kind of minimizes the effect of these 3D elements on the page as well. So do the enamel dots, same thing. Because there's other pieces that are lifted, it helps to minimize the impact of having a 3D embellishment so that they don't draw all of the attention. But it really is fun to have non-paper embellishments on your page. And I think in this case, they really add to the circular theme that was already happening in the background, adding on those circles as well. Now this one may not look super 3D, but I have tucked some epoxies into the side of my photos here, and I wanted to show you why I like epoxies so much. So these photos are not lifted on foam, but I'm still able to tuck 2 of them underneath of my photos, as well as outside of my photos. And actually adding foam under a couple of these embellishments raised them higher than the epoxies. One of my favorite ways to add a non-paper but also not super dimensional embellishment is definitely the epoxies. I'm a huge fan of these. They come in lots of colors. These ones are from Pink Fresh Studio. I think it was the Office collection. So that is this one. Here's another one using Flare. Now I've used it a little bit differently here. I've tucked it in amidst florals. And the reason that I did that is because these florals are quite flat on the page. And so I've added these 3-dimensional pieces just to give a bit of interest and dimension to the overall page. I've popped up several pieces here on foam. Again, if you're going to use a 3-dimensional object on the page, you might as well go all in and add some foam lifted pieces as well. It just adds a little bit extra to a page, I think, and just makes it so much more interesting to look at. And so this one has 2 pieces of Flare from Cocoa Vanilla Studio. So this layout, you might be looking at it going, no, wait a minute. Now I don't have a lot of these pulled out. This is kind of a knitted fabric heart here and here, and they are 3-dimensional. They do have a little bit of thickness to them, but not a lot. A little bit more than epoxy, not quite as much as Flare. And what I love about these is because they're so soft, they are fabric, and so they're so soft that they just mesh in beautifully with paper and don't really catch your eye the way that a plastic piece probably would. And so that's another 3D non-paper embellishment that you can definitely use. These came from Cocoa Vanilla. I know there's some others that carry stars and things like that, but I just wanted to include this one because I love these so much. Okay, so here's a large piece of acrylic on this page. And I wasn't sure how I was going to use this. It's kind of an atom nuclear science shape here. But by popping it onto an area of the layout where there wasn't as much going on, it was allowed to stand on its own and not draw too much attention to itself. It's the major embellishment piece for this part of the layout. But it also ties in things like the black that's already existing across the page. And so it does blend in with those other black elements. It is quite dimensional, but I've also used wood veneer on this page. And so there's other dimensional things along with a large foam star and foam letters. So it's not the only thing that's standing up, which again, helps it to mesh into the background quite nicely and not draw too much attention away from my photos. I've also positioned it pretty close to one of the photos so that if it does draw your attention, it then leads the eye into the sequence of photos. So that's a fun one for the acrylic. Here's another one with the epoxies, and using the epoxies this time to direct the flow of the photos. So in this case, I have 2 here at the bottom, and they're guiding you either from this side or this side to the next set of photos. And I really like that. I think it's fun to see these photos in order, but it's also fun to kind of look at them and then look at them this way. It's just a fun way to direct the eye of the person who's looking at your layout. So think a little bit about that and how you're positioning things like arrows and chevrons to what they're pointing at, because that's pretty important when you're putting them on your layout. Here is the last page. We've got a bit of acrylic and epoxies happening on this one. So I've used acrylic stars all down the center here to help to delineate my photos from my large title. I've also used the arrow epoxies to point into my photos. This one pointing in from a large cluster, this one pointing in from my title, again to help direct the eye. One of the things to keep in mind here is I have both photos popped up onto foam to make sure that they stand out as being the focus of the page. These stars actually kind of stop the eye a little bit. So when you're looking at this photo and you hit these big thick stars, your eye kind of stops and goes down and follows the stars down. So it leads you to the next photo in my journaling. And that's definitely their purpose, is to help guide the eye where I want you to go. Using big 3D embellishments to just really focus in and highlight the areas that are important can be a very, very effective way to guide the eye of your audience. I hope this one was helpful, guys. Be sure to let me know in the comments below if you can think of other ways to use non-paper 3D embellishments on your layouts. And if you have any other products you'd like to see me go through and talk some ways to use them on layouts, let me know that in the comments below as well. Until next time, bye guys.